the sake of continuum out there in cyberspace, there needs to be a retelling of several stories already told relative to the question, how do we know that we know? And how do we know that we have the proper authority? The first story is a story about the seeker after truth, who'd studied the ancient scriptures and practiced the practices that went along with them. But after he'd exhausted the sources of knowledge that were available to him, he had the inspiration to go to seek out one who was called the teacher of the age. But this required a long and very arduous journey. But he made that journey and found his way after many vicissitudes, adventures. He arrived exhausted at the door of the great master of the age. But just as he was about to enter the doorway, the great master stood up and shouted to him, "Get out! Get out! You have found your way to my doorway, now get out!" The poor seeker was absolutely shattered, and he backed out of the doorway in a state of what you might say was great shock. But after he left, the students who were around the master said, "Master, why did you treat that seeker so cruelly?" And so the master said, "Wait, and the answer will be demonstrated to you." And after a little while, it so happened that a bird flew in to the house of the master and began to fly around, bouncing off the walls and getting quite distressed. But then, in a state of almost absolute exhaustion, it happened to fly by a window, and just at that moment the master stood up and gave a great roar. The bird was so startled it flew out of the window to freedom. So the master said to his students, "Perhaps you could say that that great roar was a great shock to that bird, but was able to release him into a state of freedom." The second story is about a very, very rich merchant who had a son who he wished to groom to become a part of the court of the great and enlightened king, King Mahmud. So the merchant had his son, called Hyder Ali, sent to an elite academy where he learned the ways of philosophy and theology and those other higher learnings. And after completion of this academy, the merchant took his son Hyder Ali to the great King Mahmud, offering him to be placed in service with him. But King Mahmud hardly looked at the merchant and his son, just merely saying, "Bring him back in a year." So the merchant took his son Hyder Ali away, and he sent him out into the capitals of the world to learn the ways of the city, to learn the ways of the workings of society. And then after a year he brought him back to King Mahmud, who again said, "Bring him back in a year." So again now the merchant sent his son off to the great shrines and temples of the world. And after that travel, he brought him back to King Mahmud, who said, "Yes, now go and find him a teacher, and if that teacher accepts him, bring him back in a year." After a year, the merchant went to the place where his son Hyder Ali was under the tutelage of the master who had accepted him. But Hyder Ali refused to move. He only wanted to stay where he was. So his father, the merchant, totally disenchanted, abandoned his son, leaving him there with the teacher. But there came a moment not long after when King Mahmud said to his trusty advisor and servant Ayaz, "Come, we must go on a pilgrimage." So setting out with an entourage, King Mahmud, Ayaz and his troop travelled to that place where Hyder Ali was. When they approached that place, the master took Hyder Ali's hand and led him out to the gate of that place. And when King Mahmud arrived, the master said, "When this being went to visit kings, he was nothing, but now it is the kings who visits him. He is ready. Take him as your advisor." And so it was. And the final story is about that king who had in his court a dervish, a great and learned dervish. And one day the king said to the dervish, "It is known by myself that dervishes have far greater knowledge and power than kings. If indeed I know this," as the dervish conceded, said the king, "then I must be worthy to receive the teachings that will allow me also to attain this knowledge and power." The dervish merely said, "One must wait for the appropriate moment." And so it was that day after day, the dervish came to the king's court, but no mention was made of what had been asked by the king. Now the king got impatient about this, but he could do nothing. But then one day it so happened that someone came to the king and said, "Your Highness, I have heard that there is a great musician and singer who it said, his voice is so mellifluous it surpasses even the angels. And suddenly the king had a great thirst, a great longing to hear the sound, the music, the voice of this singer. So he immediately sent off an emissary to the singer's house, who was called Dowd. But when they arrived there, the singer, Dowd, merely said, "Go, I only sing when I am inspired to sing, and I certainly am not at the beg and call of kings." Now the king was very angry about this, and he said, "Who is it? What can happen that will allow me to hear the music and the voice of this musician while I still want to hear it?" And the dervish stepped forward and said, "Come with me, Your Highness." Now somehow the king knew, so he called for clothing to be bought and stripped himself of his royal garb and put on the garb of an ordinary being. And he and the dervish made their way to the house of the great and famous musician and singer, Dowd. But when they arrived there, the door was not even opened to them. And Dowd shouted through the door, "I don't feel like singing today or playing. Go away." But at that moment, the dervish began to sing the favorite song of this musician. And as the king listened, he was enchanted. And after the dervish had finished singing, the king said, "Please, sing it for me again." But what the king did not know was that the dervish had sung the song just slightly off key. And at that very moment, from inside the house came the sound of the voice and the playing of the lute by the great musician Dowd, bringing the king and the dervish to a state of bliss as they listened. After the song was completed, the dervish was able to turn to the king and say, "You see, there are certain requirements needed." What are those requirements? If we accept, as the stories imply, that we have to be tested before we know that we know, and know that we have the proper authority, what do these stories just told tell us about the other requirements before we can claim to know that we know and know that we have the proper authority? What say you? What do you glean from these stories? We need to be tested, but there are several other factors told in these stories that make it clear for us. What are they for you?